Welcome, dear viewers. Today's episode is called 1290. Why did England expel the Jews, and did it regret it? For 366 years, England remained a land without Jews. Not officially, not legally, not openly. The kingdom that once depended on Jewish moneylenders to build its castles and finance its wars decided in the summer of 1290 that it could do without them entirely. King Edward I signed an edict. 3,000 people had until November 1st to leave or face consequences that would not be pleasant. What happened next would echo across centuries. So, let's begin. On July 18, 1290, the date was no coincidence. In the Hebrew calendar, this was the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, the day commemorating the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Jewish chroniclers would later note this timing with something they described as awe. Edward I chose the most painful day in the Jewish ritual calendar to announce that England no longer wanted its Jewish population. The text of the actual edict has been lost to history, but the writs sent to sheriffs across the kingdom survive. They were blunt. All Jews must depart before All Saints' Day. Any found after November 1st faced seizure and the end of their journey. The expulsion did not emerge from nowhere. It culminated 2 centuries of a relationship that began with mutual need and ended in calculated abandonment. When William the Conqueror crossed the Channel in 1066, he brought Jewish merchants with him from Rouen. Christians in medieval Europe faced a theological problem. The church forbade usury, the lending of money at interest. This was considered sinful, a violation of Christian principles. But kingdoms needed capital. Castles required financing. Wars demanded funds. The Norman kings found their solution in Jewish moneylenders who operated outside Christian prohibitions. The arrangement seemed elegant. Jews could lend money. Kings could borrow. More importantly, kings could tax their Jewish subjects without summoning parliament. Jewish communities became what one historian would later describe as a giant monetary filter. Jews collected interest from borrowers throughout the kingdom. The crown then extracted this wealth through taxation at will. Between 1219 and 1272, English monarchs imposed 49 separate levies on Jews, totaling 200,000 marks. This was an astronomical sum. To put it in perspective, the tax Edward I received in exchange for expelling the Jews was 116,000 pounds, likely the highest single tax of the entire Middle Ages. The Jews had already been taxed far beyond this amount over the preceding decades. One man embodied the wealth and influence of England's Jewish community in the 12th century. Aaron of Lincoln died in 1186. Possibly the wealthiest person in the kingdom. His fortune was estimated at 100,000 pounds, quite possibly exceeding the wealth of King Henry II himself. Aaron conducted business from Lincoln, but had been born in London, the center of medieval Jewish life in England. He lent money to Robert de Chesney, Bishop of Lincoln. He lent to Henry II. His clients ranged from great monastic houses to the Archbishop of Canterbury to small local borrowers. The system worked because everyone understood the crown would enforce Jewish collection of debts. By the late 12th century, Christian debts to Jews were recorded on official government documents and kept in official government chests. The rulers of England maintained a complete register of all debts owed to Jewish lenders. But something was shifting beneath the surface of this economic arrangement. The First Crusade launched in 1096. Christian fervor to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslims began to redirect itself toward Jews at home. If Christians were fighting infidels abroad, why tolerate non-believers at home? The propaganda intensified. Jews became characterized as Christ killers, violence against whom could be justified, legitimized. What would you think if I told you we can measure the exact moment when royal protection ceased to function? September 3rd, 1189. King Richard I, known to history as Richard the Lionheart, held his coronation. Benedict of York, one of the leading Jewish moneylenders, attended. He was attacked. Some accounts say he perished on his way back to York. A rumor spread across England like a fire through dry timber. The king had ordered the expulsion of the Jews. This was false. But false rumors fueled by crusading zeal and economic resentment can be more powerful than truth. The violence that followed would create one of the darkest chapters in English history. Riots erupted in Norwich, in Stamford, in Lincoln, and then in York. On March 16, 1190, approximately 150 Jews, the entire Jewish community of York, took refuge in the royal castle where Clifford's tower now stands. They barricaded themselves in the wooden keep. Outside, a mob gathered. The rioters were not merely angry peasants. They were led by members of the local gentry, Richard Maelbees, William Percy, Marmaduke Darrell, Philip de Fauconberg. These men had borrowed heavily from Jewish moneylenders. They had failed to secure lucrative royal appointments. They could not repay their debts. The riot presented an opportunity to erase those debts permanently. Inside the keep, the Jewish families faced an impossible choice. Rabbi Yom Tov of Jewry and Jos of York, one of the community leaders, oversaw what happened next. Rather than fall into the hands of the mob, the community chose a different path. To avoid what they believed would be a worse fate, the father of each family made a terrible decision regarding his wife and children. Rabbi Yom Tov then ended his own life and set fire to the keep so bodies could not be mutilated. Some refused this option and survived the fire. At daybreak, they emerged, appealing for Christian mercy in return for baptism. The mob provided no mercy. Those who came out were killed. The rioters then marched to York Minster, where records of debts were kept, and compelled the guards to hand them over. These records were burned. Excavations at Clifford's tower in the 20th century uncovered blackened remains of that fire. King Richard ordered an inquiry. The city of York received a heavy fine. But by then, the instigators had escaped. No individuals faced consequences for what happened that night. Some likely joined Richard himself on crusade. He was by then en route to the Holy Land through France. A new Jewish community would eventually establish itself in York. They would remain for 100 years, until 1290. Let me tell you something that official histories often obscure. Jews in medieval England contributed far more than financial services. They worked as doctors, as goldsmiths, as poets. They participated in intellectual and cultural life. But by the late 13th century, their economic utility to the crown had been systematically destroyed. Not by accident, by policy. In 1275, Edward I issued the Statute of Jewry. This legislation attempted something remarkable. It outlawed usury for Jews, completely. Jews were given 15 years to transition into other professions. They could lease farms. They could become merchants. They could work as laborers. The statute also confirmed earlier rules. Jews over age 7 had to wear identifying badges shaped like stone tablets. Jews over 12 paid a special tax of 3 pence each Easter. They could only sell property or negotiate debts with royal permission. The Statute of Jewry was presented as an attempt to integrate Jews into Christian economic life, to convert them away from the sinful practice of money lending. But here was the problem. Guilds blocked Jewish entry into trades. Popular prejudice made agricultural pursuits nearly impossible. The 15-year transition period was a cruel fiction. Jews could not easily shift into other economic roles because the same society that forbade them from lending money also prevented them from doing much else. Meanwhile, Edward I had repeatedly overtaxed the Jewish population. By 1289, when he returned to England from Gascony, raising significant sums from Jews had become increasingly difficult. They had been squeezed dry. Edward was deeply in debt. His wars with France demanded financing. On June 14, 1290, he summoned representatives of the knights of the shires, the middling landowners, to attend Parliament by July 15th. Then on June 18th, he sent secret orders to sheriffs in cities with Jewish residents. The archi, containers holding records of Jewish debts, were to be sealed. This was preparation. 3 days later, Parliament met. The taxation granted to Edward was extraordinary. £116,000, probably the highest of the Middle Ages. The church later voluntarily agreed to pay an additional tenth of its revenue in gratitude. In gratitude for what? For the expulsion of the Jews. The bargain was clear. Parliament would grant Edward unprecedented taxation. In exchange, he would remove the Jewish population from England. It was a transaction. 3,000 people's lives traded for financial relief and political favor. On July 18th, the Edict of Expulsion was issued. Writs were sent to sheriffs explaining that all Jews were to leave by All Saints' Day, November 1st, 1290. Proclamations were made ordering the population not to injure, harm, damage, or grieve the departing Jews. Wardens at the Cinque Ports were told to make arrangements for safe passage. What were Jews allowed to take with them? Personal possessions, cash. What did they forfeit? Everything else. Homes, debts owed to them, synagogues, cemeteries, all became crown property. A few favored individuals received permission to sell their homes before departure. The vast majority had no such luxury. Queen Eleanor's tailor was granted the synagogue in Canterbury. William Burnell received property in Oxford, which he later gave to Balliol College. The Crown distributed 85 grants of Jewish property to courtiers, the church, family members. By spring of 1291, most property sales were completed. The Crown raised approximately £2,000. £20,000 worth of debts were seized, but barely anything was collected from these debts. Why? Historians propose several explanations. Queen Eleanor passed away in November 1290. War with Scotland loomed. Or perhaps Edward made a political calculation. Providing benefit to those previously indebted would win favor. Forgiveness of debts purchased loyalty more effectively than collection. The departure itself produced its own horrors. While official records show no attacks on Jews during the land journey, the sea crossing was different. Acts of piracy occurred. One notorious story tells of a ship captain who took Jewish passengers to the Thames estuary while the tide was going out. He convinced them to walk with him on the exposed sand. Then he abandoned them and returned to his ship before the tide came back in. They had nowhere to go as water rose around them. Other stories exist of Jews being robbed, but most seem to have crossed the channel. The timing was cruel. November 1st approaches the season when dangerous storms are common in the English Channel. The expulsion was not designed for safety or comfort. Where did they go? France, Spain, Poland. Many sought refuge in regions where they hoped to rebuild. But their exile from England did not lead to stability elsewhere. France would expel its Jews in 1306, 16 years after England. Spain would follow in 1492 with the Alhambra Decree. England's expulsion set a precedent. It was the first time a European state permanently banned Jewish presence. Not a temporary measure, not a local pogrom. A complete kingdom-wide expulsion by royal decree. This became a model for other European monarchs. Did England regret it? Let's examine what happened next. In December 1290, Hugh of Kendal was appointed to dispose of seized Jewish property. The most valuable consisted of houses in London. The Crown used £100 from property sales to glaze windows and decorate the tomb of Henry III in Westminster Abbey. Edward I continued to use the expulsion as a political tool after 1290. He positioned himself as protector of Christendom against Jewish criminality. He sponsored the cult of Little Saint Hugh of Lincoln. This was a child whose supposed ending at Jewish hands had led to popular veneration. It was a blood libel, a fabricated accusation. Edward's craftsmen rebuilt Hugh's shrine in the same style as the Eleanor crosses. They included memorialization of Queen Eleanor and the royal coat of arms. One historian would later observe that a more explicit identification of the crown with ritual accusations could hardly be imagined. What about the economic consequences? The removal of Jewish communities disrupted local economies that had relied on Jewish financial services. Christian lenders eventually filled the void, but their lending practices often imposed harsher terms on borrowers. The sophisticated financial infrastructure that Jewish moneylenders had built, the recording systems, the enforcement mechanisms, the international connections, all of this disappeared. Alternative financial systems developed. Italian banking families, particularly from Lombardy, stepped in. Edward I himself had already been borrowing from Italian bankers. This reduced his reliance on Jewish moneylenders and made the expulsion economically feasible from his perspective. But for smaller borrowers throughout the kingdom, losing access to Jewish lending created difficulties. There was another cost, intellectual and cultural. Jewish scholars had been involved in various fields: science, medicine, philosophy, literature. Their expulsion led to a decline in intellectual activity in certain areas. Many of these scholars had been at the forefront of their respective fields. The loss of their contributions meant England missed out on advancements in knowledge and culture that other regions of Europe where Jews remained would benefit from. The social fabric was disrupted too. Jewish communities had been integral to life in many towns. They played roles in local governance, trade associations, community structures. Their absence led to reorganization of social hierarchies as different groups compete for control of resources and influence. Comment below and let me know what you think about how this decision shaped England for centuries to come. Between 1290 and 1656, there was no official trace of Jews in England, except in connection with one place, the Domus Conversorum, the House of Converts. This institution housed Jews who had converted to Christianity. At the time of the expulsion, approximately 100 converted Jews lived there. Records show the Domus Conversorum kept converted Jews within its precincts up to 1551, and even later. The last of the pre-1290 converts was Clarissa, daughter of Jacob Copen. She passed away in 1356. She had spent the early part of the 1300s in Exeter, where she raised a family. But were there really no Jews in England during these centuries? Official records say no. Reality was more complicated. In 1376, 4 complaints were made to the king that some of those treating as Lombards were actually Jews. The expulsion was unlikely to have been wholly enforceable. Some Jews probably remained or quietly returned while keeping their religion secret. Cryptojews, those who had converted to Christianity but continued to practice Judaism in private, found ways to operate in England. In the 16th and 17th centuries, a trickle of these Jews, often traders, settled in England. They were officially Portuguese or Spanish merchants. Unofficially, some maintained Jewish identity. The shift came in the mid-17th century. England had gone through civil war. The monarchy had been overthrown. Oliver Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector. And suddenly, the question of Jews in England became a matter of international diplomacy, commercial strategy, and religious prophecy all at once. The story of how Jews returned is less about a single decision and more about a series of calculated moves, theological beliefs, and economic interests converging. Menasseh ben Israel was born in Lisbon in 1604. His family fled the Portuguese Inquisition and settled in Amsterdam. By his 20s, he had established a printing press. He became a rabbi, a scholar, an author, a publisher, a polymath. He cultivated connections throughout Europe. In 1650, he published a book called The Hope of Israel in Latin and Spanish, later in English. The book expressed a millenarian belief. The Jewish Messiah would only appear when Jewish people had spread throughout the world to the ends of the earth. One place remained notably absent from this global dispersion: England. Menasseh was not operating in a vacuum. In 1651, Oliver St. John led an English mission to Amsterdam, attempting to secure an Anglo-Dutch coalition. The mission failed in its primary objective, but St. John and his envoys met extensively with Manasseh ben Israel during their time in Holland. They were impressed by his learning and manner. They advised him to formally apply for Jewish readmission to England. In 1653, Cromwell himself issued an official directive. Manasseh ben Israel, a rabbi of the Jewish nation well respected for his learning and good affection to the state, was authorized to come from Amsterdam to these parts. Manasseh initially declined. The First Anglo-Dutch War was ongoing. Local anti-English opinion in Amsterdam made the timing unwise. But Cromwell had reasons for wanting Jews in England. Commercial reasons. Competition with the Dutch for trade had led to the Navigation Act in October 1651. This protectionist commercial policy aims to boost English maritime trade. Cromwell recognized that Jewish merchants, particularly those of Amsterdam, trading with Jamaica and Barbados, possessed valuable commercial networks. If these merchants could be attracted to London, they might transfer their important trade interests from the Netherlands to England. Jewish immigration would serve the policy embodied in the Navigation Act. This was not primarily about religious toleration or hastening the millennium. It was political expediency. There was also a theological dimension. Godly Protestants, including Cromwell, believed the conversion of Jews to Christianity was essential before Christ would return to reign on earth. 1656 was thought by some to be the actual year this would happen. The flood, it was claimed, had taken place 1,656 years after creation. Millenarian expectations ran high. Readmitting Jews to England could help fulfill prophecy. But we should be clear, Cromwell's religious views were complex and often subordinated to political calculation. When it became necessary to choose between different religious principles and political needs, Cromwell demonstrated remarkable flexibility. In September 1655, Menasseh ben Israel finally arrived in London with a delegation and members of his family. He personally petitioned Cromwell for readmission of the Jews. The petition requested citizenship, freedom of worship, burial grounds, freedom to trade, and withdrawal of all laws against Jews. Cromwell summoned the Whitehall Conference in December 1655. Some of the most notable statesmen, lawyers, and theologians of the day attended. Their task was to discuss whether Jews should be readmitted to England. The debates revealed deep divisions. Theological misgivings on one hand, commercial rivalry on the other. Merchants feared Jewish competition. Some proclaimed that Jews were responsible for events surrounding the trial in Jerusalem and should not be welcomed. Others worried Jews would attempt to convert Christians to Judaism. The conference rapidly concluded that there was no legal impediment to Jewish return. This was a crucial finding. Since Jews had been expelled by royal decree of King Edward I and not by formal parliamentary action, there was technically no law forbidding their presence. But the conference could not reach agreement on whether readmission was desirable. On December 18, 1655, Cromwell intervened. When the doors of the council chamber had been opened to the public, and William Prynne's newly published anti-Semitic work, Short Demurrer to the Jews, had become accessible, Cromwell saw the way the wind was blowing. Rather than force a vote that might produce harsh restrictions, he dissolved the conference. Nothing formal happened. No official decree of readmission was issued. Many continental Jews who had accompanied Manasseh to London despaired and went home. Manasseh remained, growing increasingly pessimistic. Then in early 1656, an unexpected crisis altered everything. England declared war on Spain. Antonio Rodriguez Robles, a Marrano trader dealing between London and the Canary Islands, had his property seized. Robles petitioned for return of his property on account of being of the Hebrew nation rather than Spanish. At the same time, 6 leading members of the new Christian community petitioned Cromwell for permission to gather for worship and acquire a burial ground. Cromwell endorsed the petition on March 24, 1656, and confirmed it 6 months later. No formal permission was granted in writing, but assurances must have been given. By summer, Menasseh asked for a Torah scroll to be sent from Amsterdam. In autumn, Moses Atheist moved from Hamburg to act as religious preceptor. By December 1656, the community had rented a house for use as a synagogue. Services began in January 1657. A burial ground was established at Mile End. By the end of the decade, the number of Jewish families in London had risen to 35. In 1657, Solomon Dormido, Manasseh's nephew, was admitted to the Royal Exchange as a licensed broker without taking the usual oath involving a statement of Christian faith. The readmission was not a dramatic reversal of policy. It was a quiet accommodation, an informal arrangement. In some ways, this worked to Jewish advantage. Since there was no formal decree of readmission, there were also no restrictive laws that would later need to be repealed when Jews wanted fuller citizenship rights. The arrangement was tacit, discreet. As long as Jews made themselves unobtrusive, they would be tolerated. Manasseh ben Israel passed away on November 20th, 1657, at Middelburg. He had returned there to bury his son, Samuel. He never saw the full fruits of his diplomatic efforts. Cromwell himself passed away on September 3rd, 1658. The Jewish community immediately worried. Their protector was gone. Would the arrangement survive? In 1660, soon after the restoration of Charles II, the City of London Corporation raised a petition against the Jews, predictably, but it went nowhere. The Jewish presence continued, quietly, gradually expanding. The Bevis Marks Synagogue, which still stands today, would be established. The community grew. In the 16th and 17th centuries, European rulers began inviting Jewish merchants into their territories, hoping to stimulate commerce and fill state coffers. The English arrangement, informal though it was, fit this pattern. Look at what happened over subsequent centuries. By 1739, Jews acquired the right of naturalization in British colonies. In the 19th century, between 1830 and 1858, they successfully campaigned for political rights in Britain itself. The path from informal toleration in 1656 to full political emancipation took 2 centuries, but it happened. The expulsion of 1290 had created what some historians describe as a strong strain of something else within English identity. The idea that England was unique precisely because it did not include Jews. This notion outlasted the medieval period. It shaped attitudes for generations. But there's an irony here. The very kingdoms that expelled Jews in the medieval period later found themselves inviting them back. Why? Because the commercial and intellectual contributions Jews made were not easily replaced. Eastern Europe, particularly Poland and Lithuania, emerged as new centers of Jewish life after Western expulsions. Polish kings like Bolesław the Pious recognized the economic and administrative skills of Jewish communities. They granted protection and privileges. Poland became one of the most significant havens for Jewish refugees. By the 16th century, Eastern Europe had become the heart of the Jewish diaspora. This shaped Jewish identity and communal life for centuries, well into the modern era. So did England regret the expulsion? Not officially. No English monarch before the 20th century formally apologized for 1290. The economic disruption was felt for decades after the expulsion, but England adapted. Christian lenders filled the void, however imperfectly. The loss of intellectual and cultural contributions was less visible but real. What England lost in 1290 was not just 3,000 people. It was the infrastructure of financial expertise they had built, the international networks they maintained, the medical and scholarly knowledge they possessed. Consider this carefully. When Cromwell contemplated Jewish readmission in the 1650s, the arguments in favor were largely economic and geopolitical. England wanted access to Jewish commercial networks, to trade connections with the Spanish Main, with Amsterdam, with emerging colonial markets. The theological justifications about hastening the Messiah or converting Jews to Christianity provided cover, but the core motivation was practical. England needed what Jewish merchants could provide. This suggests a kind of recognition, even if unspoken, that expelling them in 1290 had created a gap. The expulsion of Jews from England in 1290 was internationally significant. It was the first monarch to permanently exclude Jews from a kingdom, the first English monarch to use religious prejudice as an instrument of state policy. The tactics employed, the attempts at forced conversion through the Statute of Jewry, the seizure of property, the timing on a day of religious mourning, all of this set precedents. The 1492 Alhambra decree that expelled Jews from Spain followed a similar pattern. Across Central Europe, expulsions multiplied. England showed that it could be done, that an entire population could be removed, that their property could be seized, that there would be no lasting consequences for the crown. Except there were consequences. They just took centuries to manifest. The Holocaust of the 20th century had roots in medieval expulsions and blood libels. The idea that Jews were fundamentally separate from Christian society, that they were dangerous, that they could legitimately be expelled, or worse. These notions did not originate in 1290, but 1290 normalized them at the state level, made them official policy rather than mob violence. When you can expel an entire population by royal decree and face no repercussions, you've established a dangerous precedent. In May 2022, the Church of England held a service that Archbishop of Canterbury Justin Welby described as a formal act of repentance. This was on the 800th anniversary of the Synod of Oxford in 1222. That synod passed a set of laws restricting Jewish rights to engage with Christians. These laws directly contributed to the expulsion of 1290. 800 years later, the Church acknowledged its role. That's how long it took for formal acknowledgement. Today, York holds an annual interfaith Shabbat service. Daffodils are planted each March around Clifford's tower, their 6 petals echoing the Star of David, commemorating the 150 who perished there in 1190. English Heritage has consulted with Jewish leaders about properly honoring the site's dark history alongside its medieval tourism value. At the foot of the tower, a plaque marks what happened. It's easy to miss if you don't know to look for it. Inside the tower, explanations are being expanded. A park is planned, with a peace garden dedicated to tolerance, a memorial to those who sought sanctuary and found something else entirely. The Jewish community that returned to England in the 1650s built something new. They founded synagogues, burial grounds. They integrated into commercial life. By the 19th century, Jews held positions in Parliament. Benjamin Disraeli served as Prime Minister. The modern British Jewish community is approximately 280,000 people. They've contributed to every aspect of British society: science, arts, business, politics, medicine, law. In 2026, England's Jews are as British as anyone else. Their ancestors were expelled in 1290 and returned in 1656. 366 years of official absence. But absence does not erase history. Here's what 1290 teaches us. Expelling a population for short-term political and economic gain creates long-term costs that are difficult to measure. Edward I received his £116,000. He seized Jewish property worth thousands more. He won political favor from Parliament and gratitude from the Church. In exchange, England lost the most sophisticated financial infrastructure in the kingdom, international commercial networks, medical and scholarly expertise, and an entire community that had lived there for 2 centuries. The transaction seemed favorable in 1290. By 1656, English rulers were working to undo it. The question isn't really whether England regretted the expulsion. The question is whether those who benefited from it cared about the costs others paid. The nobleman who burned debt records at York Minster after the massacre of 1190 didn't regret anything. Their debts were erased. Edward I, who used anti-Jewish sentiment to secure unprecedented taxation, positioned himself as a hero. The Church, which received grateful acknowledgement for supporting expulsion, faced no reckoning. Regret requires accountability. It requires acknowledging harm done. Medieval England never did that. What changed by 1656 wasn't a moral awakening. It was calculation. England wanted what Jewish merchants could provide and found theological justifications for accommodation. The arrangement remained informal precisely because full acceptance would have required admitting the expulsion was wrong. Better to allow quiet return than to confront the injustice of forced departure. This pattern repeats throughout history. Populations are scapegoated, expelled, their property seized. Then, decades or centuries later, when their skills and networks are needed again, they're invited back under different terms. The cycle continues because the original wrong is never fully addressed. 1290 was the year England chose short-term gain over long-term wisdom, chose prejudice over pragmatism, chose political expediency over human dignity. 1656 was the year England quietly acknowledged it needed what it had thrown away, not through apology or restitution, through tacit toleration and commercial self-interest. The 366 years between these dates were filled with absence, with the silence of empty synagogues and closed cemeteries, with the erasure of a community that had helped build medieval England's economy. On July 18, 1290, Edward I signed an edict on the 9th of Av, ensuring that Jewish chroniclers would remember the date with awe for centuries to come.